Good evening, everyone. I'm Jennifer Steinhauer. I'm the editor for Live Journalism, based in Washington, D.C. It's my pleasure to bring the Beltway to all of you here tonight in New York, as well as our online viewing audience. I would like to give a special welcome to our New York Times subscribers to thank you for your role that you play in our journalism. Our event tonight is part of the TimesTalks series, live conversations between New York Times journalists and the brightest and most innovative minds in politics, policy, film, art, business, and technology. Tonight, we are so pleased to welcome Eric H.J. Holder, Jr., Chairman of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee and President Obama's first Attorney General, the first African-American to hold that position. Currently, Mr. Holder is working avidly on voter protections as we head into the midterm elections. Here to interview him is someone who knows the topic well. He's one of the paper's chief political writers who has covered elections across the country and one of the lead reporters covering Donald Trump's presidential campaign in 2016. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Alex Burns, and our very special guest, Eric Holder.
They love you.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
It was all for him, I understand.
Yeah, right. No, really, thank you all for being here. Thank you for joining us.
Sure.
And I want to say thanks also to those who are watching online. Just a word about how this is going to unfold. General Holder and I are going to talk about many, many interesting things for the first part of the program, and then we're going to go to questions from all of you, and folks online should be sure to submit questions of their own. There'll be microphones roaming, and you should put up your hand and wait for them to come to you. So you have said, the last time we spoke in Washington, you said that it was your goal to make redistricting sexy again.
See?
So I want to start with a really, really sexy question for you,
all right,
which is about the U.S. Census.
All right. That's my next thing I have to make sexy.
Right. So the Commerce Department announced this week that they're going to be asking people about their citizenship status in 2020. You have said this is an outrage. You've said you're going to go to court. And I wonder if you could explain why.
Well, this is the first time that that question has been asked on the long form since 1950. And you can't view the asking of that question or the placement of that question on the census form in isolation, given all that this administration has done, starting with the announcement of President Trump's candidacy, when he talked about the disparaging way in which he talked about Mexicans, and then all the things they have done since they have been in power. I think this is clearly an attempt to discourage people of immigrant backgrounds from raising their hands and being counted. And I think we have to understand that, you know, the question seems in some ways kind of benign. Are you an American citizen, or however it is phrased? And there may be people who, in fact, are American citizens, but who interact with people who are undocumented. And the American citizens may fear that by subjecting themselves to the census, they will put at risk people who are in an undocumented status. But I think the overall aim of the placement of that question is political. It's interesting that the request came from the Justice Department to the Commerce Department, but it came from the Justice Management Division, JMD, in the Justice Department, which is responsible for the administration of the department. The question didn't come from the Civil Rights Division, where it normally would have come from. And so there are all kinds of things that I think betray the true motives in trying to place that question on the census. And yes, we're going to sue.
So when you think about, do you know when and where you're going to sue?
No, not yet. We are in the process of putting the lawsuit together, and I expect that we'd have something filed in court probably in the next couple of weeks.
And when you talk about challenging this, is this going to be a challenge, you know, on the basis of discriminatory intent, or is it going to be this might be a false binary, but is this going to be a sort of a procedural challenge that, this part of the Justice Department has no business getting involved in this?
I think it's a couple of things. I think this will be really interesting. The Administrative Procedures Act will say that this was arbitrary and capricious. That's very sexy. And I think then also say that they have failed with regard to their constitutional obligation. In the Constitution, it says you're supposed to do a decennial counting of the people in the United States. It doesn't talk about citizens, and in fact, it talks about 3/5. The 3/5, in the Constitution, the 3/5 compromise is included there. And so this notion of putting this question there, where I think every living census director, I think, has now said this is a bad idea, and not having tested it before to see if this will have an inhibiting influence on people in certain communities. There are a whole range of things that I think that we can bring into a lawsuit. And then, I think this is one of those instances where I think the president's tweets and his public statements will become relevant.
In what way?
Well, to show the true intent of what it is they are trying to do, that it is not as benign as they would make it out to be, through the words of Donald Trump, through the tweets of Donald Trump. You'll see what the true intention was of the administration.
Does that just knock you out at all, though, that, when you look at now the list of Trump administration policies, starting with the travel ban, running through DACA, and I guess from what you're saying now that have been challenged in court just on the basis of stuff the president has said publicly. Do you feel like at some point the courts will run out of patience for these, let's put the president on the couch based on his tweets kinds of arguments, or do you feel like that's just the gift that keeps on giving?
Well, it is certainly the latter. I mean, it is certainly the gift that keeps on giving, and that's both good and bad. It makes for much easier lawsuits when you are trying to show intent, which is a difficult thing when you're generally dealing with governmental agencies. So that part that's, as you say, the gift that keeps on giving. But the reality is that those statements are really the foundation for many of the policies that this administration has put in place, which I find extremely disturbing.
How much harder would it be to challenge these policies if the president were a more disciplined man?
I think it would be more difficult. Some of the things that have been done, though, and the way in which they have been done are so outside the norm that they would you still have a pretty good basis at challenging them. Though even there, I don't know, the Justice Department does things in certain ways now that in ways that the department has traditionally not done. I don't know whether that's a function of, I wonder how much of that is a function of reacting to the president, where we're not seeing him, we're not hearing him. So you need discipline on a whole bunch of levels. Stay away from your iPhone, your Twitter device, and also don't say to the Attorney General or put pressure on the Attorney General to do things that presidents don't typically do with their AGs.
So let's tie this to redistricting. What are the implications for the congressional map if that question gets asked?
Well, it's interesting. There are a number of things that happen. First, the flow of dollars from Washington to various parts of the country could be affected by an undercount. And I think one of the things that people in this country need to understand, I think people think, well, it's all going to be about California. But really, if you have an undercount of the immigrant community, undocumented community, that will have an impact in Texas. It'll have an impact in places where you have seen recent surges of immigration, Arkansas, Alabama, North Carolina. So there will be that. And then the undercounting really has to do with, when in a political sense, we have to make determinations about how many representatives you get in a particular state. If there is an undercount, that will decrease the number of people, number of representatives that state could have, and it also has obviously an impact on the state level as well.
Does it all change your thinking about just you've talked about the redistricting committee that you're leading being really focused on 2018 and 2020. Does this kind of thing at all sort of open up the possibility for you that, no, this might actually be like a decade-plus legal fight if the counting ends up happening in this way?
Yeah, I think, this is a multi-cycle effort, and I think we'll go beyond the redistricting that's done in 2021. But the stakes are so high between now and 2021. We've got to get this right in terms of the election in 2018. There's some off-year stuff in 2019. Obviously, 2020 is big in terms of the election and the census, and then the grand finale is what happens in 2021 with regard to the redistricting. But assuming that things are not done appropriately, I can see litigation and litigation that goes beyond 2021. So I think this could lead into the next decade. Although one of the concerns I have is that if we are not successful at this, we could have another decade. We'd have a decade similar to the one that we are, that we're in the process of leaving, and 2 decades of gerrymandered Republican rule might become really entrenched. And at that point, if you look for the 2030s, it would be, I think the job we have now is difficult but doable. I'm not sure that it would be doable, in 2030.
So you won in court today.
Yep.
In Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's another gift that keeps on giving, Scott Walker just keeps saying, like, hit me, Eric. I'm like, oh, okay,
So do you feel like so the background here is that there are a couple vacancies in the state legislature. The governor has declined to call special elections for them, saying it's a waste of time, it's a waste of money. You've sued saying it's an obligation, and you've now had 2 court rulings.
I said the Wisconsin statutes say that you have to fill these vacancies as promptly as possible, and you actually have timelines that are clear. I mean, clear, and the judges have had no problems at 3 levels, indicating that what Governor Walker wanted to do was, inappropriate and illegal.
And do you feel like that sort of case closed, like you've won there, or do you feel like there's another couple rounds of you?
Oh no, I don't know. Scott Walker's not giving up. We've won at the district level, first appellate level, the next appellate level. I don't want to almost suggest tactics to them, but I think that there's more that they are likely to do. There have been indications that the legislature might get involved, and that would be interesting to see if they do something that's inconsistent with what the courts have said should happen, and they do it ex post facto after the courts have made a determination. That leads to what is potentially, I think, an interesting legal question. So we'll see.
So you're now litigating around the timing of special elections. You're talking about suing the federal government over the census. These are all sort of related to legislative power and redistricting, but they're not sort of suing about Voting Rights Act violations on specific maps or the cases challenging partisan gerrymandering specifically. How wide do you feel like your legal mandate is with this group? Are you going to be filing voter suppression suits? Are you going to be doing sort of election integrity broadly, or how narrowly do you still want to focus on the lines?
I mean, I think that we want to focus on, we view the electoral system through a redistricting lens, and in that way I think we bring a certain discipline to that which we do. But you can't ignore that there are things that are related to that disciplined view. For instance, the question of felony disenfranchisement, which will be voted on by citizens in Florida. That's something that, again, if that were done away with, and it should be, that could potentially put, 1.2 million, I think is the estimate, 1.2 million new voters into the system. And that could have a dramatic impact on Florida, which is one of our target states. So I think that we have to be involved in that in some form or fashion. When it comes
involved in the referendum there?
Yeah, I expect that at a minimum I'll be going down there to talk about it and try to raise awareness about it and try to encourage people to do, from my perspective, the appropriate thing, which is to say that given the history of felon disenfranchisement, that this is something that we need to do away with, in Florida.
In the Supreme Court today, Justice Ginsburg, they were hearing a case on redistricting brought by Republicans in Maryland against a map that the Democrats pretty well cut up. And Justice Ginsburg seemed to suggest that wherever the court comes down on partisan gerrymandering, it's too late for the 2018 elections. And I wonder how discouraging that is for you.
Well, I love, RBG. But what I'd like to think is that, if they gave us a favorable decision in late June, that we could get into court, as relatively quickly in a variety of places. And I think the possibility, not a great possibility, but the possibility exists that we might be able to have an impact as early as 2018. Maybe, maybe. But in any case, the cases that are before the court, the Wisconsin case, the Maryland case, I understand Justice Breyer suggested, bringing in a North Carolina case. The decision that the court renders is so important that, if it didn't have an impact in 2018, but did have an impact in 2020, it would still be extremely significant and have a direct impact on the redistricting in 2021.
But if you were to get a favorable ruling from the Supreme Court about partisan gerrymandering and these elections took place on the maps as they currently exist.
Yeah, and that's,
I mean, does that raise legitimacy questions for you about the election?
Yeah, it really does. I mean, and that's one of the things that kind of gets me, if courts make these findings and use the language that they have used in some of these partisan gerrymandering cases, or even these racial gerrymandering cases, and then they stay their decisions pending review by a higher court, and then people go to the polls, in these districts that the court has made, factual legal findings that they are discriminatory or drawn inappropriately. That always strikes me as, exceedingly strange. And you're asking people to participate in a system that you have found to be, you, judge, have found to be, or the judicial system has found to be, bogus, inappropriate. And so that's why I think that these things, let's say the court decision was to go our way. When the Supreme Court, finally, I guess, said that the Brown v. Board of Education decision, I guess, and the decision after that said, with all due speed or whatever, that needs to be a part of this, to say that this is our decision and that it must be implemented, as quickly as is possible.
Does it? Do you have any sense of sort of regret or frustration that you didn't go after these maps when you had the Justice Department under you?
Well, we did go after, we did a lot of things when we had a Voting Rights Act that was fully constituted. We did a whole variety of things that that were, that I think were appropriate. But I think this really all goes back to what happened after the shellacking the Democrats took in 2010, the redistricting that happened in 2011. And I'm not sure that, at that point, we really understood what this was going to mean or understood what the impact of that inappropriate redistricting in 2011 was going to be like. It's taken at least, some time to be able to see what Republicans have done with that power, I would say illegitimately obtained. And so, yeah, I mean, in hindsight, hindsight's always 20/20, and yeah, now knowing what I know, I think there might have been things we would have tried, might have tried to do. On the other hand, we have certainly, there is a record now that we have that we didn't have then. We know that what happened in 2011 really set the tone for the decade. And we see, for instance, in 2012 in Wisconsin, where Republicans got less than 50% of the vote, and it got 60 of the 99 seats in the state assembly. And we've seen that then, that margin just stay pretty consistent throughout the course of the decade.
So are you prepared, if you do win these cases, or if you do manage to sort of flip the balance of power in some of these states, one of the things that would happen if you had a fairer, distribution of the lines in some of these states that are very, very gerrymandered, both gerrymandered by Republicans and gerrymandered by Democrats, is you would have members that are currently in safe seats suddenly having to run real races for the first time in a long time. And that includes a lot of Democrats. Right. It includes a lot of very liberal Democrats. And I just wonder, are you prepared, however the chips fall at the Supreme Court, to go to the House and make the case to members of Congress from Manhattan, members of the Congressional Black Caucus, members from big cities who have not had a race in a long time, that you guys are going to have to work for your job?
Yeah, I mean, I had a meeting with the House Democratic Caucus, I guess about 2-3 weeks or so ago, and told them about our plans, things that we had done, things that we were planning to do. And yeah, I'm prepared for that. I understand that what you have said is likely to be the case. But here's the deal. I actually think that if you make this a fair contest, and we're not trying to do this so that we are gerrymandering for Democrats. I'm just saying, let's just make this a fair fight. And if you make this a fair fight between Democrats and progressives and Republicans and conservatives, Democrats and progressives will do just fine. We'll do absolutely fine. And I've got confidence in that.
How was that message received?
Generally pretty well. I'm sure there were at least a couple people who wanted to say, but they didn't express themselves. But but if you're in a district that is, I don't know, 85% Democratic, 85% Republican, and you go to a district that becomes 50-50 or something like that, or even if you go a little below, Bobby Scott, African-American congressman from Virginia, actually volunteered and said, my district is drawn inappropriately.
He said that in the meeting?
No. This happened a couple of years or so ago. And his district went down, I think, 60% African American to less than 50%. But he had confidence that he would have the ability, given his service, given his knowledge of his district, that he would be reelected. And as a result of what he did and his lack of opposition to a lawsuit that was brought, another Democratic seat was created. Another African-American seat was created.
So I want to ask you about some other election integrity issues. Gerrymandering is obviously part of what a lot of Democrats see as broken with the political process. I wonder how troubled you are by the revelations about this data breach at Facebook, the use of people's private, or what they believe to be private information by folks who are not supposed to have it in the election.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's extremely troubling. I'm not a Facebook user, so I don't, I can only sympathize with all of you. My only electronic thing is Twitter, and I'm only barely mastering that, which, as I understand, is much simpler, I guess, I don't know, than Facebook. But it's disturbing to think that there was that, the disclosure of private information, and then also disturbing to see how that information, or how the platform, was used. I guess when I was out in Wisconsin campaigning for a Wisconsin Supreme Court justice candidate, there were indications that the Russians were using the shooting of a black man there to try to foment discord, and to try to use it in an electoral way for candidates who they wanted to support. And to think that they have that degree of sophistication, that they have access to that kind of information coming off a variety of platforms, is both disturbing and and I think unacceptable.
And what does it say to you that I want to come back to that word you use, unacceptable, but what does it say to you that the Russians who were contacting Americans to try to sort of stir up stuff in the election, what does it say to you that they went so quickly to race policing, trying to stir up essentially in very, very crude ways racial divisions?
Well, there are a few things in our society that are relatively obvious. We are still a nation that is dealing with racial issues. It is one of the things that is most easily used to divide people, and it doesn't require huge amounts of sophistication to see that, to understand that, and to see that that's a tool that you might use. Now there is that, and there may be a certain degree of sophistication on the part of the Russians in that regard, but it's also possible that they had Confederates, colluders, on the American side who helped direct them. I mean, I don't know. We'll I guess, find out all about this as Bob Mueller does his investigation.
We're definitely going to come back to that.
I had a feeling we were going to get there.
When you say, let's set the question of collusion aside, whether there was sort of direct contact or anything like that. If the Russians had access to American social media platforms, ability to get data on individual Americans, and to advertise to them or direct bots at them with messages of division, basically unregulated. Does that say to you that the government needs to step in on these platforms?
I mean, I think so. There are some basic questions that need to be asked. That question has to be asked. You companies. There needs to be, I think, a certain degree of freedom. We don't want to stifle the creativity that comes from those platforms, the degree of freedom that people have in the way in which they interact with one another. But given the fact that so many people get so much of their news, from these platforms, I mean, my kids, young 20-year-olds, I'm sure they read the Times. And the paper version of that, But aside from the Times, they're getting their news from a variety of places. And, so I think there is a component, there's a way in which I think we have to think of these platforms as communication companies. And what then does that mean in terms of how they should be regulated? They're maybe not exactly like traditional communications companies, and so maybe we ought to be looking at a different regulatory scheme. But I think some kind of certainly I think these hearings that are coming up, I hope that there will be, but I hope we'll keep to a minimum the grandstanding that will go on. There needs to be a real a substantive interaction between people who run these platforms and people who pass the laws, so that we can come up with a scheme that will protect people from the kind of breaches that have occurred.
But would you, I mean, just on a personal level, you would view Facebook as having sort of too much unrestricted power in elections?
I'm not sure. I don't know about that. And I really, what I'm saying is that I'm not trying to dodge the question. I really just don't know Facebook very, very well. I mean, I look at my wife's, and it seems that, it's always about somebody's grandkids, and they're at a ballet recital, and there's pictures of their, but clearly there's a news component that she's not getting that I don't have.
But if you had if you had a broadcast network with the market share that Facebook has in social media, you'd never let that go unscrutinized, unregulated.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I mean, I think that there's some degree of regulation would be appropriate. But again, I don't necessarily want to, so quickly equate Facebook with, traditional media companies, because I think they're probably substantial or substantive differences that need to be addressed in trying to decide what the regulation would look like.
So I just want the record to reflect that I've waited 27 minutes. If you were Bob Mueller, and you saw this Facebook story, this Cambridge Analytica story, how would you go about sort of probing the relevance of that?
My guess is that Bob's already done this stuff, My guess, knowing Bob Mueller and knowing the people that he has surrounded himself with, I think that with all due respect, the media's catching up to what they have probably already been doing. But I think, you'd want to know, who in Russia was getting this information, how are they getting this information, were there any people in the United States who were helping in that regard. We talk about collusion all the time, and that's not the right word. The word that we ought to use is conspiracy. Use the legal term that they have to be looking at. I mean, can you make a case on the basis of the conspiracy laws? I don't think there's as I look at the United States Code, I don't think there's a crime called collusion, but there is a crime called, conspiracy. And so I think you'd be looking for the conspirators. We assume they did an indictment, I guess, 2-3 weeks or so ago, named 13 people, 3 entities. who are involved in a variety of things. So it's clear that they are looking at the Russian side. Now the question is, what's going on the American side? Are there connections here? And so I would be, subpoenaing electronic information. I'd be looking at, telephone records. I'd be bringing people into, for conversations, interviews, and always making them aware of the fact that if you lie, that doesn't go well with me, and seeing what people had to say. And I suspect that they have probably been talking to people that we don't know about.
Several of my colleagues broke the story today that the president's former lawyer, John Dowd, had sort of raised the idea with representatives for Michael Flynn and Paul Manafort that potentially a pardon could be on the table. Dowd has denied this, but it's pretty well confirmed by journalistic standards. And I wonder what you see as the relevance of that to this larger investigation. What does that tell you about sort of the mindset on the Trump side?
Well, assuming that it's true, it is pretty disturbing. And I think, but I think what people have to understand is that the pardon power really is absolute. I mean, and so that if President Trump decided that he wanted to pardon Paul Manafort, Manafort would be, he'd be free. Well, the potential charges you'd bring against him could not be brought, or the charges that have been brought about him would have to be dropped. But that wouldn't be the end of the story. The question would be, although that is the president's power, there's no question about that, if the use of that absolute power is for an inappropriate purpose, an illegal purpose, that could be a specification in an obstruction of justice indictment against a president. But the other interesting thing is that if Manafort has been pardoned, he no longer has a Fifth Amendment privilege. And therefore, all right, Paul, you're pardoned, congratulations. I want you to meet the grand jury, These 23 members of our community who would like to ask you more than a few questions. And he would have no basis not to answer those questions. And if he did not answer truthfully, he then could be charged with perjury.
And if your view is that the president's pardon power is absolute, then why would it be? Under what circumstances could it be obstruction to say, I don't think these are legitimate charges, and I think Paul's a great guy who's done phenomenal work for me and other folks around the world? And like, how could that be unlawful?
Well, no, and yeah, if that in fact is true, then there's no crime. But if you say that, you say he's a great guy and he's done wonderful things for the world, but you've got emails or other information that indicate that the real reason for the pardon was to derail an ongoing investigation. Just because you say something doesn't mean that what you say publicly is true. That has to get tested. And if you find out that the real motivation for the granting of the pardon was something illegal, that is a problem for any president.
You've said that it should be a red line, that it should be cause for impeachment if the president fires Mueller. What do you think is an appropriate response to if the president were to do just sort of a blanket pardon, that I'm done with this investigation, everybody involved with it ought to be able to go on with their lives, starting with me?
You mean pardon himself?
Just pardon everybody, yeah.
Well, I'm not sure. As I say, the pardon power is absolute. I'm not at all certain that a president can pardon himself. I think that actually there's a legal question. There's a legal question there. But I would think that if you had a blanket pardon, you just pardoned everybody. I think the president says this is an illegitimate inquiry. I'm pardoning everybody. I would hope that would, that would be a spine injection would happen for the Republican members of the House. That, it seems to me, would be an impeachable offense. I mean, to simply derail what is clearly a legitimate investigation being run by a person who has an unblemished public record and who, by the way, is a Republican, to derail that investigation in the way that you described, it seems to me would require action by the legislative branch.
So under your leadership, the Justice Department signed off on a highly politically charged prosecution in North Carolina of a former presidential candidate who was alleged to have violated campaign finance laws in covering up an extramarital affair, paying hush money to a number of people. This is the John Edwards case. It's been cited many, many times, including on 60 Minutes this last Sunday, as a reference point for the whole Stormy Daniels saga. Would that, based on what you know publicly, do you think that comparison holds up? Would you approve a prosecution along these lines?
You know, it's interesting. The Edwards case was interesting because I was recused from that case. So I was part of the vice presidential search team for President Obama, and Senator Edwards was one of the people who we were considering, and so did a whole variety of things in connection with that, so that when that case was in the department, I was recused from it. And I will say I was never really a fan of the prosecution. You know, the whole question of, you know, Stormy Daniels, yeah, I know. I find it hard to believe that the conversations that we have about the conduct of this president, they're mind-blowing, you know? I mean, and I think to myself, you know, you gave my guy grief because he wore a tan suit, you know? And people are, you know, giving, you know, evangelicals, you know, giving Trump a pass on this one, you know, and that one, and that one, and, you know, and I don't quite understand, you know, I really just don't understand how this has not had the reaction generated that what I would have generated by, I think, any other president, not just President Obama. If President Bush had done these kinds of things, that would have been, you know, at the end of his presidency.
On a legal level, though, when you say you weren't a fan of the Edwards case, would you be skeptical of actually prosecuting somebody for this sort of hush money scheme that we know about?
I mean, I don't know enough about the facts, you know, but if money were given to a person, to her, in order to keep her quiet, you know, a month before the election, I mean, yeah, that's something that is certainly worthy of investigation. And then the question again becomes, you know, I just don't know enough. I mean, so Cohen says he gave her the money. I've read, I think this is true, that he took out a home equity loan or something like that. I think that's what I read. If that's true, you know, that's one thing. But if, on the other hand, you did it at the behest of people in the campaign, you know, that's maybe a little different. So I'd need to know more facts. It's certainly something that's worthy of investigation.
I want to keep on sort of taking you down Justice Department memory lane. So in 2012, you announced that there were not going to be any prosecutions related to the Bush-era interrogation and torture programs, and you now have, you know, the president has nominated Gina Haspel for CIA director. You know, she's somebody who was involved in those programs. You know, you said at the time that the announcement about the prosecution or the lack of prosecutions was sort of not the end of the story, that there was still going to be sort of a moment of reckoning. I wonder if you think that moment of reckoning happened, and I wonder if you have any regrets about the way that was handled.
No, I mean, I think that, you know, I got a lot of criticism for reopening that investigation into those use of those enhanced interrogation techniques, which I'm kind of feeling right now I'm in the middle of with these lights, you know. And these are kind of Dick Cheney-like questions. But that's okay. But I got criticized for, you know, reopening that investigation. Had a very capable Assistant U.S. Attorney John Durham do a very, very thorough investigation. And we made the determination that for a variety of reasons, we couldn't bring cases. I would hope that through the confirmation process, questions will be asked of the nominee as to what her role was, where she was, you know, when she was, I guess, in Thailand, I don't know. Was she there at the time these techniques were going on? Was she aware of them? There's a lot in what John uncovered that is now that's still covered by, you know, grand jury secrecy, that at some point I think the American people need to see. People need to see what was done in our names. And I think there are, although we couldn't make criminal cases, there are lessons that should be learned from that. America should never do what was done during the time period that we examined. And there's also, what the Intelligence Committee did. Senator Feinstein, Senator Whitehouse. There's I guess 5,000-6,000 page report. I think that also it becomes a relevant document. And so declassifying that to the extent that that's possible. Try to deal with the grand jury secrecy issues. Try to declassify and put this stuff out there so that not just in connection with this nomination, American people need to know what exactly happened during that time period.
But does that information need to be out there in order for this nomination to really be scrutinized?
No, I mean, questions I think can certainly be asked, but there's a range of information that I'm not sure the members of the Senate generally have had access to. Members of the Intelligence Committee probably do. Those who were there when the investigation was done, who are still there, they have context. And I think that context is important. I think that all the members of the Senate should have that. But as I said before that, I think the American people really need to be able to see this information.
Before the current administration took over, there was this kind of, I think it'd be fair to describe as sort of a détente between the Justice Department and the marijuana community that you sort of shepherded in. And that's obviously been sort of upended by General Sessions. I wonder if you could talk about sort of how you approach that overall. Did you ever consider rescheduling pot, and do you think it's time?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was time to reschedule marijuana when I was Attorney General. I was part of an administration, and I had raised the concern about marijuana should not be a Schedule I drug. But as part of an administration, and the administration as a whole made the determination that that was not going to be the position we were going to take. I have been very public about, as I'm saying now, when I left the administration, I think that it needs to be rescheduled so that research can be done and we can actually understand what the medicinal benefits are, to the extent that there are medicinal benefits to the use of marijuana, for instance. That's one of the things that you can do you can do more easily if it's rescheduled.
Would you go as far as decriminalization?
I'm not sure. I mean, I actually think that I liked what we were doing, which is to say, the federal government's going to step back and we're going to let the states experiment, and we're going to see, what goes on here. I remember talking to the governors of Colorado and Washington, and said, now you guys, look, the deal is we have to make sure that what you are doing, you're going to have a regulatory scheme in place that is going to be as serious as you say it's going to be, and we're going to test that. And if it's not, then we have retained our power to come in and use federal law enforcement power. But I think, using the states as a laboratory to see, how this works would then give us a basis for making a national decision. And this is a determination I think we're going to have to make as a country ultimately, but I think we ought to do it on the basis of some experimentation, some real-world experience. And I think the way in which we had set it up would have allowed for that experimentation.
So I've asked you about pot, so now I have to ask you about running for president.
That's a logical connection.
When we first spoke about the redistricting committee, you said running for office was not in your future. And you've been much, much more ambiguous lately. And I wonder if you could just sort of talk through, if you were going to do it, why would you do it? If you didn't do it, why would you not do it?
If I were going to do it, I would do it because I would think, I would have concluded that I could maybe unify the country, that help unify the country, because it's bigger than any one person, that I could advance, well actually, that I could repair and then advance, the nation in a variety of contexts, that I thought I had something to, contribute. That would be, I think, the thing that would push me towards, considering a run. On the negative side, you know, I've been in public life for you know, fair amount of years. I remember you know, some unpleasant hearings with some congressmen who are now leaving. I'm going to miss them. And you know, to subject myself and my family to that again would be that could be a negative. It's an easy, you know, for me it was part of the job, you know, right? You know, I read about, you know, holders corrupt, holders, you know, whatever. It's all politics, and I just dismiss it. But I saw the impact that it had on my family. My wife had a Google alert. You know, and I said, sweetheart, you can't do that, you know, I mean, because you're going to just drag into, you know, everything. And, you know, she took to heart, you know, I mean, it bothered her in a way that, you know, it didn't necessarily bother me. And the thought of going back into public life, I mean, that's something that I'd obviously have to consider.
Does it bother you at all to look at sort of the setup of the nomination process and you know, you look at who makes up the base of the Democratic Party and who the Democratic Party represents in Congress and the Senate. You look at Iowa and New Hampshire, there's a pretty big gap between those constituencies. Is it time to sort of reconsider that calendar, to open up that process?
No, you know, I mean, I think, you know, it was interesting. I went out to Iowa early, I guess in 2007, campaigning for President, then Senator Obama. And I remember speaking to relatively large crowds, you know, something like this size. And I also remember sitting, I think it was a place called Washington, Iowa, where I sat with 4 people, and they all had pads. And these folks took their obligations as, you know, the first state very seriously. And they had their written questions, and they would write down very dutifully the answers that, you know, I was giving. So I think that there is something to be said for the weaning process that occurs in Iowa, that occurs in New Hampshire, you know, South Carolina, Nevada. I seem to know how this goes.
You seem to know a thing or two about this.
But I think it's you know, I do like the idea of California moving itself up, you know, so that it becomes a more relevant player in the process than it's been.
Whether or not you run, do you think we've seen the last all-white Democratic ticket?
That's an interesting question.
Maybe I should ask you, do you hope we've seen the last all-white Democratic ticket?
You know, I mean, from my perspective, it's really just a question of identifying who the best people are. And I think that, you know, we have, as a nation, tended to think that there is a tension between diversity and excellence, you know? And from my perspective, diversity breeds excellence. And so I would think that you know, there are, I think, some great people who would, people of color, who would be, you know, great on the ticket as president, vice president, you know, and if we're talking about diversity, you know, women who would be great as, you know, presidential nominees or as a vice presidential nominee. And my hope would be that we will break out of that which is traditional. You know, we've done it twice with our last 2 nominees, and I will note, won the popular vote all 3 times. You know, and so I think, you know, the country's ready for, has shown that it's ready for diversity. So yeah, you know, my hope would so I think that history is there. And I think we also ought to be mindful of where the country is, you know, now. This country is in a different place than it was in 2016, I think, already. And 2008, though, is almost, you know, a lifetime ago. So we have to be ready in 2020 for the issues that we're going to have to confront at that time.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to go to the audience. So get your questions ready, and we're coming right at you. The special election in Pennsylvania early this month. It's a district President Trump won by 20 points. Democrat won it by about 600 votes. The Republicans, in sort of explaining the defeat, largely blamed their own candidate. They said he's you know, had a lackluster message, was a lazy campaigner, didn't raise enough money. And what I want to get your reaction to is they said he had a mustache. And I just wonder how personally do you take that kind of rhetoric?
You know, I'd not heard that before. Now I'm truly offended. Well, that might be an indication. If you see this go, that may mean that Holder's in, you know?
All right.
Holder 2020, if you see this go.
Let's go to all of you.
By the way, that's about the dumbest thing I think I've ever heard.
So just put your hands up and the mic will come to you. If I could just implore you to keep your questions concise and question-like, that would be greatly appreciated.
Question-like, okay.
Right. Yes, right there.
Hi, I'm back here.
Oh, sorry, you need to go to the mic.
Hi. First of all, thank you for not being under investigation. And were you under investigation by someone in Mr. McCabe's position, and you were to have terminated him, what do you think would have been the response, and what do you think should be the response to that for an attorney general?
For an attorney, I'm not sure I totally understand the question.
Well, Mr. McCabe apparently was in charge of seeing that Attorney General Sessions was investigated.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Had that happened under your term, and you had fired that person, what would you expect to have happened? Would you think that was ethical, and what do you think should happen?
Yeah, that's interesting. As I understand this, the way it's been explained is that the Attorney General didn't know that Andy McCabe had him under investigation. You know, I take him at his word, at least as far as I know. So I'm not sure that would be a basis that's a basis that gives me concern for the dismissal. But the dismissal of a long-time good public servant, 24, 26 hours or so before he would have gotten his retirement benefits, done by an attorney general who, frankly, I don't think had the guts to stand up to a president who wanted that to happen. That, I think, is unforgivable. And that, I think, you know, you take these tough jobs, understanding that at some point you're going to have to make some tough decisions. And you can't be so desirous of holding on to the job that you don't do the right thing. Sometimes you've got to be prepared to tell a president no. You know, I had, as every attorney general does, you have the ability to put up 4 portraits of your predecessors. I had Bobby Kennedy, Edward Levy, who put the Justice Department together again after Watergate, Janet Reno, and Elliot Richardson. And Elliot Richardson was there to remind me that at some point I might have to say no, I might have to give up the job for that which I thought brought me to the Justice Department when I left, you know, law school. And if somebody had given me an order, you know, I don't know all the facts, but it sure smells to me to have that dismissal occur so close in time to the retirement of, as I said, a great public servant, and especially with the trail that you saw, that tweet, you know, from the president, you know, but he said something about McCabe and 90 days or whatever it was till retirement. That, unless there were truly, truly compelling circumstances, and I don't think they were there, that would have been a no. He's not getting fired as long as I'm Attorney General.
Next question. Yeah, just speak up if you can't get the mic.
I will.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Please keep speaking out, by the way. We missed you very much. We need your voice of reason.
Sometimes I miss myself, you know.
What's your outlook when hopefully...
You're just getting the mic right here.
Thanks. What's, I guess, your prognosis or your outlook generally when our country hopefully starts to head back in the right direction under a more sane administration? Mm-hmm. How long do you think it'll take before we can undo all the damage that's being caused by all these policies, domestically, internationally, just every direction you look?
Yeah, there are some things I think that you can reverse relatively quickly, but I am really concerned that something has been unleashed in our nation that will exist and we're going to have to deal with long after a Democrat is sworn in 2021.
Or hopefully soon.
There are still things that we're going to have to deal with. There are norms. People have been emboldened in ways that are very negative. I think we have seen a rise in white supremacist groups. We have seen hate crimes. We've seen the rise in anti-Semitism, racial stuff. I mean, I think this all kind of simmers below some level of our society, and I think one of the really bad legacies of this administration is that it's allowed that stuff to come to the surface, and that's going to take a long time, I think, to for us to deal with. But I think that's why we all have to be concerned and involved citizens. We can't think that although voting is clearly important, everybody needs to vote. We've got to be more involved than that. Putting this country back together again, getting it on what I would consider the right path, is more than the responsibility of those people who we elect. It is also a responsibility that we all have as American citizens.
Well, let me ask you, Randy from Facebook sends in a question, a viewer on Facebook, not a Facebook executive as far as I know. That just sort of keying off of that, so what can Americans do, Randy wants to know, who aren't employees of the government to affect the political climate?
Well, you know what? I mean, I think that keep two events in mind. Keep the Women's March in mind after the day after the inauguration, and then think about what happened this Saturday, with those young people. What is it that we can do? Get out there, be vocal. When they were thinking about doing all kinds of negative things to Obamacare, remember how effective that was when people went to the offices of congressmen, to senators, and then when they wouldn't let them in, they'd hold up signs, what are you afraid of? Those kinds of demonstrations, those kinds of exhibitions of citizen power have an impact. And I think we underestimate the power that we still have as American citizens. I don't think that this country is going to get to the place where I think it needs to be in terms of gun safety measures, but I think there's going to be movement as a result of what these young people did. And what I said was I hope that we have here a movement and not simply a moment. But I think these kids are committed, and I think that we should be joining with them. And then we should be holding electorally responsible those people who don't do the things that we should. But I think beyond voting, being engaged, at the local level, the state level, obviously at the federal level as well. Be engaged, get out there, find time in your week, your already busy weeks, to be engaged in civic and political activity.
And Hannah from Facebook asks, do you think the controversy with Stormy Daniels is a distraction from larger issues? And I'm going to piggyback on that and ask you, do you think the president's personal life ought to be in bounds, just in general?
No, I actually don't think that. I don't think a public official's personal life, unless it has an impact on his or her performance of their official duties, should be something that we consider. If that were the case, that would have a negative. It would diminish many of the men who are considered great presidents. And I think John Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis is more important than whether or not he had a sexual relationship with Marilyn Monroe. But if a relationship that you have, extramarital or whatever, or personal, has an impact on the performance of your official duties, then I think that's fair.
So sort of TBD, whether it's a distraction.
Yeah, I mean, again, and I think at this point, I don't think that we know enough about whether that was, simply something that was inappropriate as opposed to illegal.
Right. Where can we get on?
You've spoken about how diversity is important and can lead to excellence. I'm right here.
Okay.
You've also spoken about the Voting Rights Act, but with the death of Linda Brown this week, it reminds us that our schools, our public schools, if we have any left, are more segregated now than they were in 1954. How do we get to deal with the lack of public education in this country to get to where diversity is meaningful?
Yeah, and that's, I think, something that's very troubling. I mean, first of all, I think we have to commit ourselves to the notion of having good public schools. You talk about charter schools. All right, well, that's fine. So if you have good charter schools, and you take a certain number of kids out of the public schools, you put them in charter schools, and they get a good education. There's a whole. So what are the kids who are left in the public schools? What happens with them? And so I think the answer really is to make sure that. I'm the product of a public school education here in New York City. PS 127, 148, 145, Stuyvesant. The whole thing. There we go. And I got a great education. Certainly as good an education as my kids did, and my parents paid a lot less for my education than I paid for my kids. And so I think we need to focus on our public schools and make them places that are attractive for all people to send their kids. Washington, D.C. is a city in transition now. And when I came to Washington in 1976, it was called Chocolate City. Overwhelmingly African American. It is now a city that is, I don't know, maybe 50% African American, might even below 50% now. And there is now the public school. There's a greater focus now on having a better public school system because of who is now in the who now constitutes, who makes up the city's population, and I think that's that's a good thing. We want to have, It's hard to demonize somebody that you know. It's hard to demonize a group that you know, and we talk about diversity. But what we forget, Linda Brown, we forget integration, that word, Kenneth Clark, and all of the studies that he did, and how valuable integration actually is. So having better public schools where everybody thinks that you can send your kids to get a really good education, I think that should be something, you talk about the next president, that should be a focus. I got to say that, with all due respect, the person who's now the Secretary of Education is an embarrassment, on any number of levels. And we talked about, dangers or things that we had to try to reverse. That is one of the places I think that we really have to focus.
Can we go to the back on the right there?
Hello, Mr. Holder. Thank you for coming. And I'd like to thank you and President Obama for being the gentle warriors that you are. You're greatly appreciated and missed. I don't have a question. I just want to make a comment.
We're really looking for questions here. So do you have is there anything you could ask in the form of a question?
All right. Okay.
Just raise your voice at the end of the statement.
I know it was President Obama's call to stop that situation in Nevada with the cattle rancher when the federal land agents came to take his cattle away or whatever they were going to do. And all the people that supported him came out with automatic weapons and, ready to take arms against the agents. And President Obama decided to tell them to back down because I think he, perceived that it would have been a bloodbath. And I'd just like to, say that that was a great call. I'm sure you may have been involved. But I have a question about, in reaction to that kind of situation, do you have anything to, that you can suggest or any ideas about gun control and how, you know, the weapons, the automatic weapons out there now can be so dangerous in situations like that?
And I want to ask just as a sort of add-on to that, John Paul Stevens said this week that we ought to talk about repealing the Second Amendment, and should that be on the table as part of the gentleman's question?
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, with all due respect to Justice Stevens, I'm not sure that we should be focusing our efforts on repealing the Second Amendment, because I think that's not a realistic goal. You know, I don't think that. I mean, I think, you know, his opinion in Heller, I think, is spot on. A lot of the points he made in his article, I think, are correct. But I think we need to be looking at things that we can realistically do. You know, expanding background checks, banning assault weapons, banning these large these large capacity magazines, allowing for the study, you know, of gun violence. The RAND Corporation did a study that showed that at least some of these things actually have an impact on the incidence of gun violence, and they were unable to say that all of the things that I've just talked about have an impact on gun violence because there's not enough studying, you know, has been done. So I don't think I would agree. I'm not sure I would agree with Justice Stevens, but there's clearly a need for us to address what is a gun violence epidemic in the United States. I mean, you compare us to any other nation, and we are just off the charts when it comes to you know, mass shootings, the number of people killed through the use of firearms. We have to do something about it, and it means that politicians have to be prepared to stand up to the gun lobby. You know, and if they don't, we need to put them out and put other people in.
Well, thank you again. That's it for us tonight. Please give a round of applause to General Holder. Thanks again to all of you. Please do check out the TimesTalks website for other events that are coming up. Thank you again. Okay.